Unwise decisions are covered by the third statutory principle of the Mental Capacity Act 2005. The third principle requires that a person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision merely because they make an unwise decision. The Code of Practice acknowledges that everyone has their own values, beliefs, preferences and attitudes, and so a person shouldn't be assumed to lack capacity just because other people think their decision is unwise or wrong. The principle applies even if family members, friends, healthcare, social workers or social care staff are unhappy with the decision. So one of the key aims of the principle is to limit licensed paternalism. Licensed paternalism can be described as the set of attitudes and practices where a health or social care professional determines that a person's wishes or choice shouldn't be honoured. They adopt a paternalistic attitude, they know best, and will substitute their own decisions instead. Licensed paternalism shows a distinct lack of respect for patient or person autonomy. It is undertaken for the benefit of the person in the eyes of the professional involved, although that's not always the case. The Mental Capacity Act and changes to the common law now consider paternalistic care as inappropriate and ethically unsupportable. Has it disappeared? No. Cases continue to emerge in the courts where paternalistic attitudes have prevailed, and the courts have had to reassert this principle in practice. One classic example of this is the familiar Heart of England NHS Foundation Trust and JB case, where the psychiatrist giving evidence in the case held that the woman lacked capacity because her ability to weigh the relevant information was compromised by a tendency to minimise and disbelieve what the doctors were telling her, that she wasn't listening to what I'm telling her to do, and that she wouldn't do as I say. The court was quick to point out that people don't have to agree with or accept the advice of their doctors, and that the temptation to base a judgment of a person's capacity upon whether they make a good or bad decision in the eyes of the professional, or whether they accepted or rejected the advice given by a doctor, is absolutely to be avoided. To allow this would be to allow the tail of welfare to wag the dog of capacity. So Peter Jackson, the judge in this case, said any tendency in this direction risks infringing the rights of that group of persons who, though vulnerable, are capable of making their own decisions. Another case concerning unwise decisions which would have serious consequence for a person is the King's College NHS Foundation Trust and C, concerning the lady who lost her sparkle. This was a lady who didn't want kidney dialysis because she didn't want to go on living without the lifestyle to which she'd become accustomed throughout her adult life. She was now impoverished, living in a local authority rented flat, and didn't want to continue with that particular lifestyle. In its summing up, the court concluded that the decision that the woman had reached to refuse dialysis had been characterised as an unwise decision. That the woman considered the prospect of growing old, the fear of living with fewer material possessions, and the fear that she has lost and will not regain her sparkle outweighs a prognosis that signals continued life, and it's one that would alarm and possibly horrify many people. Although the judge was satisfied that the ongoing discomfort of treatment, the fear of chronic illness, and the fear of lifelong treatment and disability are also factors that did weigh heavily in the balance for the woman. Her decision is certainly one that doesn't accord with the expectations of many in society, and certainly with the professionals caring for her. Indeed, others may consider her decision to be unreasonable, illogical, or even immoral within the context of the sanctity of life. But none of this, said the judge, is evidence of a lack of capacity. The court was satisfied that in accordance with the provisions of the Mental Capacity Act, she had capacity to decide whether or not to accept treatment, and she was entitled to make her own decisions on that question based on the things that are important to her, in keeping with her own personality and her values, and without conforming to society's expectations of what constitutes the normal or right decision, because no such thing exists. As a person with capacity, she was sovereign in respect of the decisions of her own body and her own mind. In a case where the balance between an unwise decision and an incapable decision fell in favour of incapacity, we see the judge saying that the decision that was taken was as hard as it gets. E, the lady in the case, was described by the court as a bright 32-year-old woman with anorexia nervosa, suffering from alcoholism and an unstable personality disorder. She was sexually abused between the ages of 4 and 11, and by 15 was admitted to specialist treatment for her eating disorder. In July and October 2011, she had signed an advance decision refusing resuscitation for any life-prolonging treatment. In March, she was detained under the Mental Health Act but refused tube feeding. Since then, she'd ingested no calories, and in the last 2 years, her body mass index has fluctuated between 11 and 12, representing an increased risk of sudden cardiac death. She describes her life as pure torment. Although she knows death will follow, she pleads for an end to treatment and the respect of her wishes. In the following April, the medical team, E and her parents, agreed that all treatment options had been exhausted, and she was transferred to the care of a physician who put her on the end-of-life care pathway. The case went to court because the local authority and the health board disagreed over this approach to her treatment. The health board felt she had capacity to make a decision, albeit an unwise one, to refuse to eat. The local authority felt that she lacked decision-making capacity. In his summing up, the judge said that there was no doubt that E had an impairment or disturbance in the function of the mind or brain in the form of her anorexia nervosa. In terms of the Mental Capacity Act, she could understand and retain the information relevant to the treatment decision. She was able to communicate her decision. But there was strong evidence, said the judge, that her obsessive fear of weight gain made her incapable of weighing the advantages and disadvantages of eating in any meaningful way. Strong sedative medication and her severely weakened condition added to that problem. And so the judge concluded, on balance, that because she couldn't use or weigh the information, she lacked decision-making capacity. In WBC and Z, the courts acknowledge that risk-taking is part of decision-making and part of life, and that we tend to be more risky through our adolescent and early adult years than we are in later life. In the case, a 20-year-old woman had Asperger's syndrome and borderline learning disability. She lived with her mother but did want to live on her own. She socialised with friends and enjoyed activities such as social media and music. She unsuccessfully auditioned for a TV talent show and became depressed as a result and dropped out of college. She also became sexually disinhibited and some of her sexual experiences were non-consensual. Eventually, she was detained in hospital under the Mental Health Act for assessment and then under Section 3 for treatment due to escalating concerns about the risky situations to which she was exposing herself. She was assessed as lacking capacity because she was unable to identify the risks which she exposed herself to and overestimated her ability to keep herself safe. But the court concluded, on balance, that the local authority hadn't actually rebutted the presumption that she lacked capacity in relation to the matters under review. Autism spectrum disorder was an impairment of the mind within the meaning of the Mental Capacity Act, but it couldn't be said that she was unable to process information relevant to risk for the purposes of the Mental Capacity Act. The court said it was necessary to separate out those forms of risk-taking in adolescents and young adults which could be perfectly healthy from others which were inherently unsafe. It wasn't necessary for her to use or weigh every detail of the options available concerning any risk to herself and her ability to keep herself safe in independent living, merely the salient factors. The court also held there was no evidence of her making contacts through social media that were of any concern. She developed sufficient ability to use or weigh information which indicated risk and had taken appropriate steps entirely independently of returning home when she'd formed a sexual relationship with someone she'd met through social media, but then ended it by returning home early from a visit to that person when she perceived the relationship was toxic. The question of whether the state is able to intervene where a vulnerable but capable adult is making decisions that puts themselves at risk is a question that's been raised by the courts on several occasions over the last few years. The Mental Capacity Act Code of Practice acknowledges that there may be a cause for concern if somebody repeatedly makes unwise decisions that puts them at risk of harm or exploitation, or makes a particularly unwise decision that's irrational or out of character. Now, it doesn't mean that the person, as we've seen in the cases, lacks capacity, but it might mean that there's a need for further investigation, taking account of the person's past decisions and choices.